Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today. This is your host, Joe Moore, coming at you from Breckenridge, Colorado. I hope you are having a wonderful day. Today on the show, we have a pretty interesting guest. His name is Matthew Remski. Wrote a book. He's written a lot of books. This particular one is called Practice and All is Coming: Abuse, Cult Dynamics, and Healing in Yoga and Beyond. Here's the blurb on the cover by Shiva Ray, a very famous yoga teacher. Unpacks the shadow of abuse and power dynamics while also recommending best practices essential to the evolution of yoga. You might be asking, why yoga? Well, in some senses, I kind of made this point on the show, psychedelics are at, culturally, where yoga kind of was in 1990 or maybe even 1985 or something like that. So, global retreats, you got to go all over the world. There's, renowned teachers that you're like, oh yeah, let's give them all our money or whatever, like sign over my will, or, they get, I take over their car payments or something crazy like that. So there's some really wild stories in the yoga world and the Buddhist world too. And Matthew Remski kind of lived a few of them. He got involved in a couple, and he writes about it in the book. And we get into it slightly in the show, but I think y'all will like this. And given a rash of abuses of power that have been kind of well known or well publicized in the last few weeks in the psychedelic world, I think, and beyond, like there's been abuse for probably decades in the psychedelic world, and probably even since the 50s. Well, definitely since the 50s if you start with, the CIA doing MK Ultra and whatever. And yes, MK Ultra was real. I know we haven't done a show on it yet, but coming. Let me give you a little bio on Matthew Remski. Matthew Remski is a yoga teacher, industry consultant, and author of 9 previous books, including Threads of Yoga, a remix of Patanjali's sutras with commentary and reverie. As the survivor of 2 cults, his work has been pivotal in illuminating the shadow of globalized yoga and Buddhism, and showing that disillusionment and critical inquiry can be gateways to mature spirituality. He facilitates modules in philosophy, history, and culture and community health in yoga teacher training programs internationally. He lives in Toronto with his partner and their 2 children. I think this book is important for us. And I think if you're interested, if you're involved in a community that, might be a little high stress, high involvement, perhaps check this book out. If you're running a group, check it out. We need to be aware of what's going on in the psychedelic world, and we can learn lessons from elsewhere and bring them in. This is really important. Like, a lot of the lessons we're kind of playing out now have been played out in other communities for a long time, and we have the opportunity to do it different, do it better this time. I'm sure there's going to be plenty of mistakes, and there will continue to be mistakes and abuses of power, but I think we can do better. And I hope you do too. So I think that's it for the intro. I hope you enjoy the interview. I get a little revealing, but I think it's worth it. So we've got a couple events coming up. In May, Kyle will be in Colorado with me. We've got 4 different events. The biggest events are our first ever live in-person Navigating Psychedelics course. So we're doing a full day of Navigating Psychedelics. I think we've sold a couple seats so far, which is great. And what we're going to do is run through the curriculum, kind of do an interactive style, running through the whole thing, and kind of workshop it. So you can ask questions the whole time. We can have conversations, and it's going to be amazing. And Breckenridge is beautiful, huge mountains all around. There's plenty of snow up high still. In fact, the ski resort's still open. I think it'll still be open in May. I think I saw people skiing today, in fact. So it's pretty cool. So that's going to be one of them. And it comes with the full online Navigating Psychedelics course. Plus you get to hang out in person. And you get a copy each of are two books. So what are they? The Integration Workbook and the Trip Journal. You can buy those on Amazon, but they come with the course. So you get a bunch of extras. You get to meet some community, and you get added to the private Slack community of Navigating Psychedelics alumni, which is going to be awesome. All right, cool. So that's that one. Next one, May 12th, the Sunday, we're doing a full day transpersonal breathwork workshop. So this is in the tradition of Stanislav Grof. We've talked about transpersonal breathwork on the show a bunch. Essentially, you're doing psychedelic work, holotropic states, non-drug, no drugs whatsoever, with breath, music, group process, art, and body work. So it's an amazing practice. Kyle and I have been involved for years. I've been involved since 2003. Started reading Grof in 2001 and have been hooked on breathwork ever since. This particular form, the Grof form of breathwork. He started with holotropic breathwork. This is pretty close to that. I don't actually know of any differences other than we try to bring in some philosophy to it and help you use the fruits of the history of philosophy to help you understand what's going on a little better for yourself. We're not telling you what's going on. You've got to kind of figure it out for yourself, and we support you through that. So if you have any questions, definitely hit us up. If you do both of those workshops, you get a $50 discount. So check it out, psychedelicstoday.com/events. And we'd love to have you. It would be amazing if you would come. And we're doing 2 free meetups the Tuesdays before and after. And it's just at a bar in town. It's going to be fun. I think they're giving us some discounts on food and whatever. So I think that's the May the 7th and the 14th. You can find all that again on psychedelicstoday.com/events. And, perhaps bigger news. We're providing our first ever course for physicians. So we have a doctor's course, and that's going to be pretty cool. So it's 5 weeks. It comes with a full online Navigating Psychedelics course. We do 5 live meetups where we discuss the content, get into all the particulars of what you want to know. So we're doing the physician course assisted with Dr. Matt Brown. We're going to try to get some recordings with other physicians about psychedelia, hopefully psychiatrists, because they have, obviously a particular specialty. Folks allowed in this course are doctors, so MDs, DOs, nurse practitioners, and I think PAs as well, so physician's assistants. If you're into naturopathy, you can come, but your questions are going to be really specialized and really specific, perhaps. So, I think we plan on doing one for naturopaths in the future, just not yet. So we're also doing an edition for nurses, therapists, clinicians in general. So doctors, if you don't want to hang out with other doctors, you can take this one. Also 5 weeks, and we've got a general audience one as well. That's going to be amazing. So again, 5 weeks of meetups with us. So 5 hour and a half, 2 hour sessions with the whole crew. You get a Slack where you can communicate with the whole class and Kyle and I through the whole thing, and we'll be really participatory the whole time. And it's going to be amazing. So check that out, psychedelicstoday.com. You can find the links, and we would love to have you. And I think that's it. So thank you all for listening, and I hope you enjoy this interview with Matthew Remski. Bye-bye. Welcome back to Psychedelics Today, everybody. This is Joe Moore. Today on the show, we have Matthew Remski. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Joe. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, I really appreciate your time as well. I'm going to read a quick bio to help folks here. Matthew Remski is a yoga teacher, industry consultant, and author of 9 previous books, including Threads of Yoga, a remix of Patanjali's sutras with commentary and reverie. I need to read that. As a survivor of 2 cults, his work has been pivotal in illuminating the shadow of globalized yoga and Buddhism and showing that disillusionment and critical inquiry can be gateways to mature spirituality. He facilitates modules in philosophy, history, culture, and community health and yoga teacher training programs internationally, and lives in Toronto with his partner and their 2 children. So there's a lot packed in there.
Yeah. You can start wherever you like.
Okay. So let's do a little bit of a background on you. Like how did you get involved in yoga and then start touching some of the, I guess, coming up against some of the dark side?
Yeah, I mean, yoga was a safe space of retreat and recuperation for me, actually, after about 6 years of experience in 2 high-demand groups or cults. The first one was with the group formed by Michael Roach called the Asian Classics Institute. He's still going. He's still doing his thing. Although, like many high-demand group leaders who begin to get bad press, he's moved on to places where that press hasn't penetrated. So he's doing a lot of work in Mexico and China and places like that. And that was 3 years. And then I spent 3 years in the cult known as Endeavor Academy in the Wisconsin Dells, Wisconsin. And that 6-year period really, it changed my life in very negative ways, but it also gave me some insight moving forward into group dynamics in contemporary spirituality. So I've tried to make a little bit of lemonade out of that, but it was reluctant too, because exiting the second high demand group was really facilitated by a couple of early experiences in yoga classes in which, by luck or by the skill of the teacher, I was, for the first time in a long time, given a sense of internal agency and kind of somatic autonomy. Like I was allowed to feel myself as myself again, outside of the heavy social conditioning of these groups. And that was really nurturing. It was of interest to me that a spirituality or a therapy really could be so simple and so tactile and so interoceptive and could seemingly involve nothing but my own internal guidance. And so that was really exciting. And I, of course, plunged headlong into it, not only because it was renewing to me, but also because I, having spent, I guess, from the age of 23 or 22 to 29 in these groups, this would have been the time where I would have built some kind of career, and I just hadn't. I probably could have been an academic and fulfilled a lot of earlier intellectual aspirations that I'd had I not been kind of sidetracked. But I come out at 29, and it is, what's the year? Is it 2003 or so? And no, let's see. Can that be right? No, I come out. I've got my years mixed up, but in any case, it's around 2003. The yoga industry is wide open. Teacher trainings are popping up like mushrooms. There isn't a surplus of labor in the yoga teacher training market. I'm living with my partner at the time in rural Wisconsin. There is no yoga studio there. And what do you know? It seems like a good idea to pick up some fast training and open a yoga studio. And really naively go into a lot of yoga teaching and learning by default in a way, but also kind of riding a cultural wave that we couldn't really understand the source of or see what its direction was going to be. So, but it was, on the whole, it was really good for me to feel embodied again. It was really good for me to feel as though I was in an exploratory type of spirituality or therapy. And I really didn't want to look about 10 years down the road at the fact that the yoga world is just like any other aspirational economy. It's an unregulated aspirational economy. It is filled with, very toxic social dynamics that can bundle themselves together in specific places and cause real damage. So it's a little bit of my background. I started becoming kind of a yoga culture critic in around 2012 or 13, and that progressed into research on, yoga cultishness or high demand dynamics.
So I've been really fascinated by cults for decades. I don't know why.
Right.
It's just like wildly interesting to see people doing stuff that people, might not necessarily do otherwise.
Right.
Behaviors that are harmful to themselves, perhaps others.
Right.
Like I don't know, perhaps it was early exposure to X-Files or something. I don't know. But so there's just something about it that's like there's this charismatic leader, and the charismatic leader can influence people in interesting ways.
Right.
Go ahead.
I'm glad that you said, well, I think one of your phrases was very fascinating to see people do things that might be harmful to themselves. What's key there is that that's not what they sign up for. The first principle of cultic organization is deception. And so, consciously or not, the group that gathers around the charismatic leader, and the charismatic leader themselves, consciously or not, will always be dissembling, will always be concealing their MO or their real objectives or what the organization is really about from the recruit. They may not be doing this, as I said, consciously, but what's absolutely clear is that anybody who is recruited into a high demand group really doesn't know what they're getting themselves into. Nobody signs up to be abused. Nobody signs up to be financially defrauded. Nobody signs up to be sexually assaulted. Nobody signs up to be emotionally battered or, psychologically tortured. What happens is that an organization misrepresents itself to somebody who is temporarily, situationally vulnerable. They are estranged from their families. They are between jobs. They have moved a long way from home. They've been through a divorce. A parent has died or something like that. And the group presents itself as a safe haven for the individual. And it can feel like that. It can feel like a safe haven for a good amount of time, or good enough so that a bond forms, a bond to the group forms that is very difficult to displace, and may actually feel like it's dependent upon excluding other types of bonds. So, that's kind of the first thing to know about the cultic organization is that nobody joins it. Nobody wants to join it. Nobody says, I'd like to hook up with a cult today. That has never been said by anybody. And yet people wind up in abusive, coercive situations of indoctrination and social control. And there's a big literature out there on how it happens. And I hope that one of the things that this book that you just referred to, that I've just launched, does is that it helps to normalize some of that research and popularize some of it, because it's really powerful.
So is high demand organization kind of the other phrase for cults?
Yeah, there's a bunch, actually. There's Janja Lalich, who I cite in my recent book, has a great list of synonyms. High demand is one, and I find that is really accessible to a lot of people, because it could be describing your workplace. It could be describing your extended family. It's really not enshrouded by the same type of shame that the word cult has picked up over the years, nor the kind of alarmism that the word cult sometimes carries with it or provokes. So high demand group is exactly what it sounds like. Lalich also lists the totalitarian group, the totalist group, and then the self-sealed group, or the group that forms a kind of bounded choice. And self-sealed implies that everything that happens within the group is narrativized to tell the individual that it's a positive outcome. So, if the leader emotionally humiliates you in front of the group and it feels awful, that awful feeling is actually a sign of spiritual development on your part. Or, if you take ayahuasca and you have a terrible trip and you are told by the group leaders or their lieutenants that actually that's a sign of spiritual advancement, then that's a kind of self-sealed or bounded choice environment in which everything that happens reinforces the supposed beneficence of the group dynamic. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of synonyms that I think are really, really useful. And as I said, they get away from this very provocative term cult, which emerges in a time of sociological research that's actually really charged. I mean, cult literature explodes in terms of its visibility and its popularity pretty much after the Jonestown Massacre in the early 80s. And so we have this horrible scene of 900 plus people murdered in the jungle by their leader and his lieutenants. And there was a real sort of explosion in, oh my gosh, how often is this going to happen? And to this extreme. And then even prior to that, cult analysis discourse comes out of studying prisoners of the Korean War and how they were subjected to what was then called brainwashing techniques by their military captors. And so there was, the language of cult and cultishness.
To pause real quick, is that where the phrase Manchurian Candidate kind of comes from, Korean War era?
Right, absolutely, yeah. So, or the sleeper cell, or that sort of thing. So now there's a huge there's a lot of psychoneurology now around whether or not brainwashing actually happens, whether that's a correct term or not. Usually, it's cult dynamic literature is focused much more upon the relationships that form within the group and not specific techniques that are said to, turn off faculties like light switches in individuals, because some of that is researched and some of it isn't. But the term cult comes out of these two places, like late 70s alarmism over events like Jonestown, but then this prior kind of militarized panic around what are the communists doing to our brains. So, I find the synonyms are super, super useful. And then an even better or softer and more accessible advancement in the discourse recently has been put forward by a researcher named Alexandra Stein, who I cite at length in my book, because what she does is she uses the language and theory of attachment in contemporary psychotherapy to frame what the high demand group does. And what that ends up doing is that it takes this very commonly used tool, something that every psychotherapist basically in the world is probably relying on or referring to in each session that they do, and taking that very common language and applying it to social dynamics. So what she says is that, just in a nutshell, is that what the high demand group does is that it rewires a person's attachment patterns that they bring with them towards a condition that's called disorganized attachment, where there's this scrambled feeling of not only wanting to approach the person who's apparently giving you spiritual well-being or, the secret pill or something like that, but also being terrified of them at the same time, because there's a part of you that knows that they're out to harm you, whether they know it or not. So there's a lot of ways in which cult analysis discourse is popularizing. It's becoming more accessible, and I'm really happy about that. It's good.
So I recall years ago hearing about this particular rating scale that you can use to kind of rate the organization you're involved in or a loved one is
Right.
involved in? Are you familiar with a rating scale like that?
Yeah, there's a number of models. One of the most famous ones is created by Steve Hassan, and I believe his website is called Freedom of Mind. And he's a controversial figure because he was, for over 20 years, a top recruiter for the Unification Church, also known as the Moonies. So he participated in his early breakaway days in deprogramming, which involved kidnapping. I'm not exactly sure what he did, but there was a phase of anti-cult activity that actually involved some pretty illegal stuff that wasn't effective at all, because you can't kidnap somebody out of a place that they've been kidnapped to and hope that turns out well, because that doesn't restore their autonomy or their agency. But nonetheless, like he's done very popular and accessible work. Forget the name of his main book, but he proposes in it the bite model, whereby you can assess whether a group is controlling behavior, B, information, I, thoughts, T, and the E is for emotion. And there are lists for whether or not the group is enforcing behavioral controls by altering people's sleep patterns, or demanding that they take on a specific diet, or sending them through rigorous physical exercises, or having them do physical labor, or having them work in front organizations or whatever. And then information is really key, because there's a whole list there around what the group member is actually allowed to know about the organization and how much they find out. Because cults do not present themselves to new recruits as, "Hey, imagine if your first auditing session in Scientology, when you walked in off of the street, laid out the entire worldview of L. Ron Hubbard." Like, everybody would run screaming out the door, right? So there's information control that also bleeds over into image control for the leader and image control for the organization. So there's a whole list there. Then the thoughts are, are you allowed to question? Are you allowed to think negative things about the leader or the organization? Are you given cognitive tricks to undo any kind of resistance that you might have cognitively to what you're being told? Are you being exhausted by spiritual practices, so-called spiritual practices that impede your ability to think? Like, what happens to your brain when you recite 100,000 mantras? A teacher might have you believe that you have purified something, but it'd be interesting to do the MRI scan to see what's happening in the frontal cortex and whether you lose some sort of reasoning capacity because you've chanted the names of God for 3 weeks. So then the emotions are, are you allowed to feel anger at the group? Are you allowed to express shame within the group? Are you allowed to connect with anybody at all? Are you allowed to form emotional bonds with significant others in the group? And that's a key thing when we get into attachment theory, because one of the very potent things that the more hardcore groups do is that they fuck around with your intimate relationships. They'll either split up marriages, or they'll force people to marry strangers to marry each other. They will, encourage people to have lots of sex, group sex, polyamorous sex, or they'll encourage people to have no sex at all, or they'll forbid sex. And what that ends up doing on an emotional but also interpersonal level is that it prevents the attachment bonds from forming within the group that could actually resist the group's ideology or its overall plan. So emotional control also elides, I think, into behavioral and sexual control as well. Groups are fascinated with the sexuality of their members, and it's never in a good way.
Right. Absolutely. It's an interesting subject. I'm glad somebody like you is writing on this. So for listeners, like I'm endlessly fascinated with cults. There are active psychedelic cults. A lot of psychedelic groups look like religions, and religions can often come with a lot of baggage. Even if, quote unquote maestro seems to have some sort of special knowledge, maybe it's not that special. Maybe you shouldn't give up autonomy.
And I'd like to make a distinction between religion and the dynamics that are at play in religious community and interactions and cultic dynamics. They really are separable. The most cult literature is very firm about the fact that the content of the group's ideology or devotion or its teaching content is completely irrelevant to the social dynamics that actually define it as a cult. So this is why the dynamics of political cults are identical, or they will overlap with cults devoted to yoga or cults devoted to psychedelic substances, or cults that are devoted to psychotherapy, or cults that are devoted to anarchy or to survivalism, or to the content doesn't matter. It's the elements of control that have to be really looked at carefully. So it is common for this kind of overlap to emerge, but the problem with that is that it can make people either not see that cultish dynamics can emerge in political groups, or it makes people maybe inappropriately suspicious of religious activity when there are benign religious groups, just like there are benign political groups. So I just wanted to make that point.
Right. It's a tricky conversation, right? I would say the most benign I can think of right now is a Unitarian Christian group, because there's almost no dogma whatsoever, but it's a spectrum, right?
Right.
I'm sure there's a whole bunch on that edge of the spectrum, and there's a whole bunch in the middle too.
Right. But maybe just to clarify, it's not really the dogma that that makes for the cultic group. It's how it's weaponized, and what the interplay is between charismatic leadership, manipulation, whether or not the identities of individuals are negated actively, whether or not there's deception going on, and I'll just come back to that. Is that deception is key. There is no organization that presents itself as parasitical or predatory or cultish. Every organization wants to present itself to the world as being of benefit, and it's so that makes it really tricky.
So there's a gentleman in psychedelic space right now who there's a lot of activity moving against him, thankfully, but we think he's responsible for multiple deaths.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And perhaps not directly, but close, at least negligence. And he's running amok, doing really nasty stuff to people in session and charging a ton of money, like using a taser, throwing water on their face mid-session.
What?
Yeah, it's incredible. Have you heard of this compound 5-MeO-DMT? It's from the Sonoran desert toad or synthetic.
I this is totally not my world, and maybe that's a
could be a good thing.
Could be a good thing. Not because it's a weird world or something like that, but because maybe sometimes it's good to have an outsider view on it. But wait a minute, where is this happening that he's using a taser on people?
All over the world.
In places where there are laws against citizens using tasers, presumably,
but he's using this compound in countries where it's illegal often, and others are too.
Right.
So I actually just signed kind of a soon-to-be public declaration about this guy's abuse and malpractice, and then other gentlemen's as well. He'll kick people. There's video of it too, and non-consensually dose them with like this nasal tobacco snuff mixed with other compounds from the jungle. It's a pretty intense situation.
Wow. And is the premise is what, like ego dissolution, or is he purifying people? Is that the idea? Like,
so
getting into
let me name him real quick and then we'll jump into that. So Octavio Rettig, I've talked about him online a bunch, and plenty of people have seen it. Beware of Bufo Gangsters is the group on Facebook where you can learn more and complain if you've had a situation. So the concept is, so let me back up. There's a fictitious historical context he's developed, claiming that there's a unbroken tradition of using this toad poison or toxin or whatever. And it's a DMT, so it's a really intense compound, essentially giving you the unitive experience. So not exactly a psychedelic experience. And you would read about it in yoga literature, though a lot of folks don't have the preparation or the framework or anything like that. So they pop out after, identifying with the universe for 10, 20 minutes. And then this gentleman has a smile. He's an attractive guy, 6 foot something. And, so come out and he's the father figure, like that paternal gaze that you write about a little bit in the book, like I think happens, and all of a sudden you get this wild attachment. So he's got a real deal cult going and traveling all over the world. It's really interesting to watch.
And how is the money organized? You said that there was a ton of money.
So I think he's getting at least $300 a session per person. And often at a particular day, he'll have 20 plus people. I would say probably more like 40 to 80 people a day times that money. And I think he's getting all of it. I'm sure he pays some of his assistants. This is like speculation on the pricing, but just based on what I've seen, it's a good guess.
Right. Can you tell me what how attractive is it to his recruits that he's making authenticity claims of an unbroken lineage of poison toad usage?
So pretty attractive. So imagine you met a guru that says like, hey, you know how yoga usually takes like 30 years to get you to the top, or 80 years to get you to the top? This is 20 minutes. And it's repeatable. Like you could do it every single day if you wanted. There are people smoking this stuff every day. And it's in the story, like he's developed a pretty compelling story in some of his books around this unbroken lineage that anthropologists have no evidence whatsoever for. From what I understand, he might have paid off some groups in Mexico to like lie so that he could make this work for him.
But how is that showing up? Is he citing documents or
absolutely.
Evidence? Okay.
From what I understand, there's some sort of fraudulent document that he was able to get in front of the United Nations. So he's got like UN, a document at the UN to point to, I believe.
Right. Yeah. Well, my study, my research field is the modern yoga movement, and it is filled with and built upon very thinly evidenced claims for ancient authenticity. That's a primary sort of it's a bedrock for certainty, or for a kind of comfort that people might have that this is tried and true, and the results are predictable and assured, and so on. So yeah, that's a large feature of the yoga world as well. It shows up in globalized Buddhism too. And the problem is that there's always a mixture of possible or plausible truth in the stories that are told, And so it generally takes a lot of research in very particular areas to undo things. So one of the things that I do in my book is I zero in on the usage of one particular word that the Ashtanga yoga community uses to describe its transmission process. They use the Sanskrit term parampara, which translates to one after the other, roughly. But it is usually and scripturally used to imply a ritual lineage within tantric transmission protocols that really does go back over centuries, usually through family lines. And to use that word to describe what Batabi Joyce taught to his students starting in the late 60s and early 70s is just totally inappropriate. And yet it's repeated over and over and over again to the point where it becomes like a cultural truth that Ashtanga yoga is a parampara. And so, it's very easy for a kind of fictitious or mythological history to become gelled as a fact of the marketing of a particular community. So I'm not surprised that happens and that it's attractive too. And, if there's further evidence that somebody has paid somebody for the nepotistic validation, then that's also complicated for sure.
Right. So can we talk a little bit about what are some typical harms from cults? I know we talked a little bit about kind of splitting of partners.
Right. Okay.
And money a little bit, but what else can we see?
Right. I mean, the range of impacts upon the members of high demand groups are, relational. They're financial. They are cognitive. They are labor related. The two groups that I was in, I more or less lost 6 years of my life at the center of my sort of learning productivity age. And, that time and that labor, which was all manipulated towards the group's ideology with unfulfilled promises of return, with no pay, obviously, that time I'll just never get back. The estrangement from my family during that time is something that has taken more than a decade to repair. The relationships that I had prior to being in these groups, I have not been able to restore. I was changed irrevocably, and I'm not saying that huge profile or social changes in one's life can't be beneficial. It's just that these were not expected and they weren't consensual. I didn't set out to change my entire identity. That was really done for me through forms of social coercion. The capacity. I mean, while I said that there's these overlaps between the techniques of political cults, psychotherapy cults, and cults that identify as religious, the specific crime, I believe, that cult organizations that manipulate spirituality are guilty of is a kind of spiritual abuse. And that's its own kind of category where it can make a person utterly bereft of the hope in possible change in their lives, that anything good could happen. One cult theorist puts it very poignantly by saying that the cult takes the absolute best part of you for itself, the part of you that wants to heal, the part of you that wants to serve the world, the part of you that wants to be altruistic. That's the part that it takes for its own agenda. And I think that really sticks with me because everything that I did for these two groups was motivated by a kind of altruism, but the altruism was misdirected. It was manipulated. It was felt by the organizations and by the leaders, I think, themselves as a resource that could be extracted, and so it was. I talked to ex-high demand group members probably 5 or 6 per week. I'm mainly doing journalism on this material. I'm not a counselor or a therapist, but I'm speaking to so many people, and I realize how deep the struggles are, and how few resources there are for people leaving high demand groups. Because, to be frank, there's I would say the majority of psychotherapists I know have not formally studied cult dynamics, and so there's a lot of people that show up in therapy after being in high demand groups, and the therapist wants to focus on their emotions rather than what was done to them, and that's not helpful at all. So I'm talking to so many people that I'm really feeling that I should finally go back to school and maybe do some kind of master's in counseling, so that I can tell the difference between, I can tell the difference between doing journalism interviews and, offering somebody advice. But when I slide into that mode of, somebody asking me for advice, and I have some ideas as to what resources to point them towards, but, I know that I'm not a counselor. I sometimes am in these tricky positions where I want to offer more than I'm qualified to do. So I'm rethinking that. I'm thinking about doing some counseling training. But the people that I talk to, the after effects from high demand group life can be extreme. People who have PTSD symptoms for 20 years afterwards. People who are not able to form romantic bonds for years and years. People who are estranged from their children, or estranged from their parents, or who are too ashamed to talk about their backgrounds and their normal jobs. The effects are extraordinary, and they can be pervasive in an ex-member's life.
Are there any major and well-known organizations that you think are exhibiting high demand or cultic behavior that we might not know about?
Oh, well, I mean, recent estimates are that in the United States alone, there are 8,000 high demand groups. So, I mean, it's hard to answer that. It's hard to answer that question. I think you will find these dynamics in lots and lots and lots of organizations. John Jalalich speaks about the inner workings of Enron as being cultic, in the sense of how the employees were propagandized and what was done to whistleblowers and what everybody had to do and say and think and feel. I mean, I don't think that a proper analysis of the Trump presidency is going to be complete without some understanding of cult dynamics and who's afraid of whom and what kind of attachments are formed at the center of his hierarchy. I think the dynamics can be found in a lot of different places, and that's why instead of getting into the language of cults are everywhere, I really appreciate Stein's approach of the conditions for groups forming disorganized attachment patterns are really easy to emerge, and that's what we should be looking for.
I like that. So I was really familiar with the Kripalu yoga tradition, and that kind of had its own little sexual exploit thing, though
Right.
It didn't necessarily look cultic before.
Right.
Though there was a powerful leader.
Right.
And I think in some more mainstream groups,
Yeah, I think that in the yoga world, in the modern yoga world, Kripalu is often held up as an organization that was able to reform itself after the fall of its charismatic leadership. But I think that some more research is required on that. It's very, very difficult for a charismatic-based organization to go into board of directors, code of conduct and ethics committee mode within a few short years. The power structure that allows somebody like Amrit Desai to be basically worshipped as the center of the organization and its, spiritual light, its soul spiritual light, those dynamics don't evaporate overnight. People who are deeply entrained by them and feel as though that's the way to think and to behave in the world, they're still going to be there once he ships out to Florida. And, so it's hard. Reform is hard, but there is considerable sort of industry buzz or consensus around the fact that they managed to do it somehow.
Right.
But I'd say that his Desai's influence prior to being deposed was absolutely charismatic and centering and non-democratic and mysterious and and also deceptive. He wasn't telling. The reason that there was a scandal over him having sex with his students was that nobody knew about it. It's not like that would have been permissible. He was advising many people lead celibate lives, and he was doing the opposite, of course. So, there are some key cultic mechanisms at play there, but that doesn't mean that Kripalu, quote unquote, is a cult. It's more like we have this quite large, diverse, diffuse after the first couple of years organization in the sense that there are students all over the country where, it's not really physically isolated. You don't have to be residential at Kripalu to be part of the community. There isn't a hard border where you're entering into or out of, or there's no gatekeeping for, a highly structured cult. But closer to the center of the circle, those dynamics of disorganized attachment are going to be more and more evident. And it's a similar situation to what I covered with Ashtanga yoga, where people would ask me, is Ashtanga yoga a cult? And I'd say, no, it's a global organization that is very diffuse and extraordinarily diverse. So what we have to look for is where under the umbrella of Ashtanga yoga are the elements of cult dynamics at play? Where are they concentrated? Where are they, where do they come together to spark little localized fires that cause a lot of damage, but aren't but don't destroy the entire organization. So yeah, there's one thing that I'm proud of in this book is that I've created a model for looking at large organizations that can have cultic dynamics at operation within them, but the whole thing is not definable in cultic terms. And that's a good thing, because that means that the organization as such will have some resilience to it.
So one of the cults, well, I think obviously Scientology is probably the biggest cult people know about that's doing really active harm to folks. I would say second, based on the recent Netflix film, is kind of the Rajneeshi cult. What is that called? No, I want to say No Country for Old Men, but that's very different.
No, Wild Country. Yeah,
there it is. Right. Is there anything particularly interesting or that you like to mention about the Rajneesh cult?
I can say something about the documentary, which was very popular, but I think it was very poorly done because it focused on, I think getting Ma Sheila Anand as a primary interview subject is just a total dream for any documentarian, but I think they took it too far. They gave her way too much screen time, and there wasn't any real research done into the lives of the victims of the organization. So, we had Sheila, and then we had the guy who was the lawyer for the organization. Right. And he was kind of like every second scene, he was weeping wistfully over, what a wonderful dream it had all been, but it went wrong in certain ways. Well, bullshit. I want to hear from the children who were neglected. I want to hear from the women who were sexually assaulted, if they want to speak. I want the voices of the people whose lives were ruined by the organization to be platformed, because that's what's happening when you see those fly on the wall shots of those therapy quote unquote encounter sessions where people are physically and sexually assaulting each other, and they're doing that for an hour every day. That those people are going to be traumatized for years after that. And we didn't get a sense of what the real impact was of the group, the documentarians. I think because they just weren't educated in what a victim-centered narrative would be. They went after the big names, and I'm glad that it is part of this more. This mini golden age, I think we're seeing in cult journalism, but pretty poorly done. I'd also say that Osho is still attractive to people in his literature because he presents a kind of I would call it like a faux transgressiveness, where his main sort of trick is to challenge or question or outrage bourgeois morality, or spiritual aspiration, or to deconstruct the notion that there's anything sacred or holy. And that's really it's cheap, because nothing is really offered in its place. Nothing is, the basic human support systems of securely attached relationships and, an organized economy are just completely overlooked for this message of deconstruction that can be enjoyed basically by middle-class seekers who have the money to blow in Pune or in Oregon when that was running. So, it's very attractive literature because it seems to be transgressive. But I mean, in this day and age, what's really transgressive is to figure out how to have attached relationships and, work against climate change. And, there's what bugs me about Osho, and I think even more influential is culturally is Trungpa, is that these guys are like genius readers of contemporary popular culture.
And what's Trungpa related to organization?
Trungpa Rinpoche was the founder of Vajradhatu, which later became Shambhala International, which is going through its own cataclysmic abuse crisis right now. I'm writing a feature on Shambhala right now, actually. So
and they have a spot in Boulder, is that right?
Oh yeah, Naropa University was founded by Trungpa Rinpoche. Yeah. And their headquarters, their primary temple is there, or their Shambhala center is there. They've got retreat centers throughout the country, the prominent ones in Vermont, but there are other places as well. So, but Trungpa and Osho are similar in the sense that they are highly globalized at the high point of their popularity. Their English is captivating, and yet they have retained enough of their pre-globalization identities to be, blank slates for the Oriental fantasies of all of their followers, all of their white followers, but they're also like kind of extraordinary poets of contemporary postmodern malaise. And so that becomes very attractive to their followers. the most very, very sophisticated people end up falling into the thrall of Trungpa and Shambhala International. And it's because the literature really looks good. It really looks like it's transformative. But when you dig a little bit deeper into the culture, you realize it's built on, on some very shaky relationships.
So earlier you mentioned psychotherapy cults and encounter groups.
Right.
I think the psychedelic culture was in the West was kind of instantiated at Esalen in Big Sur, California, where encounter groups were kind of the norm. And I think there was probably a handful of psychotherapy cults that kind of popped up there. But I'm wondering if you could give us an idea of what does a psychotherapy cult look like?
The same as a Buddhist or a yoga cult, but with different group practice techniques. But the therapeutic, the charismatic therapist or therapists at the center of it will usually have a unified totalitarian theory of everything that will explain every problem in the world, will be held up as the solution to everybody's internal and external problems. Many psychotherapy cults will depend upon very coercive forms of group psychotherapy that break down and humiliate members in front of each other to create a kind of social cohesion of fear that actually looks like love and acceptance. Confession is really a big deal, where members are asked to disclose their deepest secrets to the group, but that of course makes them vulnerable. It becomes a kind of collateral against leaving. Psychotherapy becomes cultic when the psychotherapist, especially in a group setting, completely ignores or abuses the back and forth flow of transference and countertransference, where somehow they are being turned into an elevated figure, and in the transference side, and on the countertransference side, they're accepting that, being gratified by it, and trying to build upon it. So I haven't studied. I've only read, because it comes up in the literature all the time. I've only read about psychotherapy cults, but those would be the basics. The confession, especially in the group circumstance, would be key, and also this general feeling that the leader knows you better than you do, or can see into your blockages or your resistances or your defenses, and can use that as a mode of coercion or control.
Okay, so I've got a slight confession. My biggest fear is to become a cult leader, and I never want to become one. So,
so how would that happen?
Exactly. No, I don't know. But my question was kind of selfish, in that we run these holotropic breathwork workshops where there is group sharing, but it's you'd only share as much as you want. We're never going to push you, and it's always meant to be private, and you better than anybody else. I barely know you, and you've been living with yourself for 30 years, 50 years, whatever. So those are the fundamental assumptions that would, I think, differentiate a little bit.
Right. Okay. So you all right. This is a great thing to talk about, though. So you're in an unregulated industry in which part of the psychedelic ritual involves a kind of, now this is while people have taken substances,
this is actually breath work. So not even no substances whatsoever. So breath and music, group art, and some body work.
Right. So, all right. So you're facilitating group experiences where one part of what's going on looks like it could be group psychotherapy. And first of all, if you're aware of that, if that scares you a little bit, if you're saying I'm afraid of becoming a cult leader, I think that's really protective. That's a really good sign. But I'd also say it's like, maybe it's a good idea to get, a little bit of formal training in what tends to happen in terms of power dynamics in those situations, because people train for like 10 years to be leaders of group therapy, right? So that they have tools to help them identify when power imbalances are accruing, even when they have the best of intentions, even when they, as you say, don't want to become cult leaders, even when they don't want to manipulate the vulnerability of group members. But yeah, I mean, the fact that you're thinking about that is great. I mean, basically, there's very few people in the yoga world who think that way, and there's a hell of a lot, you've probably noticed, of yoga teacher training programs, and I'm faculty on a lot of them, and I've witnessed a lot of training directors, run circles or group check-ins or sharing sessions or whatever, in which they just have no idea what they're doing. People share, they overshare, they break down, they cry, it's all sort of narrativized as being positive, but you just don't know what is going to happen to the person who discloses something that maybe they weren't prepared to, and maybe they felt, if not forced to, then really strongly encouraged to.
Right. It's very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Like my inner narrative is that often that is positive, but only in the context of continued helpful support, loving, caring support, not coercion or like pushing.
Right.
Yeah. It's interesting. Thank you for that. Yeah. I've been in this world since like 2003 and seen quite a bit of wild stuff. I've never seen anything that made me too uncomfortable, which is good, maybe. But yeah, I don't know. It's food for thought. I'm definitely going to be talking to folks about this, and I think like everybody that's running an ayahuasca circle should be reading this book, because know it or not, you're playing part in this really interesting power dynamic.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. And you can do all kinds of things intuitively to try to mitigate that. But, it takes a lot of work to actually really account for instance, you said, I don't know what the guy's name is now, but the guy that you referenced, you said
the Toad guy, Octavio Rettig.
Toad guy. Okay. So Toad Man's over 6 feet tall. You said he's a good looking guy.
So he's doing the long hair Jesus look.
Okay, so all right, now, at some point, everybody has to look at themselves in the mirror and say, how is my presentation, my physical presentation, my size, my gender, the way I wear my hair, the way I hold my posture, how is that going to be, how is it going to influence? How is it going to somatically, unconsciously present a kind of power or authority or space holding capacity or whatever you want to call it, that will have an impact socially upon your circle. Now, is that going to be bad necessarily? No. Is it going to be manipulative necessarily? No. But are you aware of it? That's the real question. Mm-hmm. And the somatic stuff, which is under the surface, is super understudied. I think it's easy. I don't know if there's an overlap with the ayahuasca circle here, but it's easy to see once you start looking in the modern yoga world at how, when a teacher enters the room and they have sort of an impeccable upright posture and they have this beatific maybe a little bit too Stepford-like smile on, and they're wearing white, or they're wearing mala beads or something like that, and they smell of Palo Santo, and maybe they have, I don't know, sparkly eyeshadow or something, but they look like an angel somehow, and they walk in, and to start to be aware of what bodies in the room do in response to that automatically, how people straighten up, how they begin to smile, how they immediately hold their farts in, how they, immediately begin to evoke a kind of deference to the leader without even noticing it. Like, that takes a lot of self-inquiry as a leader to be able to suss out, because chances are good, if you've put yourself or found yourself in a leadership capacity, you're probably doing some things to evoke a kind of somatic influence, and that might create power imbalances where you might not expect them.
Right, absolutely. The somatic angle is interesting. My partner in this project, Psychedelics Today, is about to complete his master's in somatic. What is it called? Clinical mental health and somatic psychology, maybe somatic therapy. So studying a lot of that somatic stuff, and I think there's a lot of value there. Because it's kind of one of the last major continents we haven't really explored very well as a culture. And I think it's going to be fascinating to see how that field develops.
Right,
yeah.
right. Cool.
Well, so Matthew Remski, your book is called Practice and All Is Coming, Abuse, Cult Dynamics, and Healing in Yoga and Beyond. I think this is... if you're in a leadership position, check it out. If you're in a group and you're a little unsure about the group, check it out.
Right. Yeah. Hopefully there is a lot of heavy investigative material that records the assaults committed by Patabi Joyce against his students over 30 years. But there is also a workbook at the end that I hope is applicable in many different community constellations. It's the intention is to help foster critical thinking and community health, and it's organized as a workbook that tries to cover the analysis of the previous chapters, but also help group members and group leaders ask questions about what the hell they're actually doing, and to look closely at motivations and sensations and relational dynamics. So I hope that's a help. Thanks for the endorsement, by the way.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been a topic I've been fascinated by and think is tremendously important. As psychology develops, so will the skills of cult leaders. So it's an important thing
Exactly. That's a really, really super good point, because absolutely the analysis of cult dynamics will be co-opted by cult leaders for sure. By the smartest ones, in order for them to say, hey, look, I'm not doing this.
And political groups. I think it's no doubt that this is going to be used politically on all sides going forward. So it's going to be interesting. Strange times, fascinating times. And let's try to deal with it intelligently and compassionately.
Good. Yeah, I agree.
Matthew, thank you for joining me. And do you have a website?
Yeah, it's just my name, MatthewRemski.com, 2 T's in Matthew. And then I'm also, you can find me on Facebook. I'm not on the other social media platforms, but I have an author's page and a personal page on Facebook. So and through my website, there's a contact form, and I try to answer all questions. So it might take a while, but I'm happy to hear from anybody.
All right. Well, thanks again for your time, and I hope we can link up again in a year or so.
All right. Sounds good.
And there you have it, Matthew Remski. His book, Practice and All Is Coming, is amazing, and I really hope you check it out. The psychedelic world needs more information on cults. The most visible examples are Jim Jones, Charles Manson, and there's plenty of cults popping up all over. So be careful if your ayahuasca shaman looks like John Travolta from Swordfish with the soul patch and ponytail and, and starts jumping around with different ladies in the group. Perhaps there's something going on there that you might want to check out. Anyway, practice and all is coming. Check it out. Cults are a big deal, and we need to know about them in this world since the power dynamic of psychedelic facilitators is wild. This is a skill that can be learned. It's we're working on helping democratize the skill set, and you'll hear more about that in the future. So again, if you want to start your path on psychedelic education, check out Psychedelics today's Navigating Psychedelics course. It's pretty amazing. It's what we wish we had when we were younger. It gets you pretty much a great framework to work with, how to reduce harm, how to talk about this stuff, and a lot of great starting points. I'm starting to think it's one of the most essential courses you can take online right now. And more coming beyond that. So we've got a doctor's course. Again, DOs, NPs, MDs, PAs can all join that one. The next one's for clinicians, so doctors could join that one. Same with nurses, therapists, anybody working in a clinical setting can join that one, and a general audience one. And again, with 5 weeks of meetups online for an hour and a half to 2 hours, we've got a Slack group that's going to be running the whole time too, so you can chat with everybody, ask questions of Kyle and I the whole time, and we would love to have you. There's limited seats. I think a couple of them only have 2 seats left, but check it out. We'd love to have you. Those kick up pretty soon, and if you're still listening, thank you. Kyle and I have some events coming up in May 11 and 12. We're in Breckenridge. We're selling these 2 workshops as a package deal. If you want to get a discount of $50, we're doing Navigating Psychedelics live in person, so you get the full Navigating Psychedelics course online, plus 2 books, our integration workbook and trip journal. I'm sure there's going to be some extras too, but if you come to that, we'd love to have you. It's the first time we're delivering it live in person and really can't wait. And then that's May 11. On May 12, we're doing transpersonal breathwork, the workshop method that Kyle and I practice, that we learned from Lenny and Elizabeth Gibson in Vermont, dreamshadow.com to check them out. And anyway, we'd just love to have you involved. So 2 free meetups too, the Tuesdays before and after May 11 and 12, 7 and 14. So anyway, thanks again for listening, and I hope you have a beautiful rest of your day and week, and we will see you on the next episode. This is Joe Moore signing off from Breckenridge, Colorado. Bye-bye.